As Tropical Storm Debbie drenches South Carolina, the region's alligators and catfish are testing new waters, from puddles to backyard pools and the roads in between. In a viral video, Robert Moose Rinney watches from his vehicle as an alligator ambles across a rainy Hilton Head Island road before taking a quick break in a puddle. Mr. Rinney says he first saw the animal in the turn lane of the busy road. "Imagine walking around the corner and seeing that sucker," he said. "It's a common fear, popping up in dubious social media posts every hurricane season, predators showing up where you'd least expect them. Fake images of sharks in storm-flooded streets are so common, they have their own Wikipedia page. But alligators in backyards? Those are real for many Americans in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas." Wildlife experts say that alligators don't typically stray too far from their natural habitats. They stick to freshwater and like to burrow down when they sense a storm coming, the South Carolina newspaper The State reports. But it's not unusual to see alligators and other wetland creatures where human neighborhoods and developments such as golf courses butt up against freshwater ponds, rivers, and wetlands. This summer, Hurricane Beryl and Tropical Storm Alberto were credited with pushing nearly 200 crocodiles to explore more populated areas in Tamaulipas, a Mexican state that borders Texas, the Austin American-Statesman reported. In South Carolina, several videos show alligators popping up on roads. One woman on Hilton Head told the Island Packet newspaper that she looked out her window to find she had a pool crasher, a small gator enjoying the shallow end. Mr. Rinney, a South Carolina real estate agent, tells the BBC that he has lived on the island, a popular vacation spot, since 1981. He says residents try to avoid the lagoons alligators live in, but they're hard to spot among foliage and in murky water, especially after storms. "They don't bug you if don't you bug them, but if they're there, you know, they're wild animals. They're unpredictable," he says, adding that he often has to warn out-of-town buyers with dogs and young children. The animals inspire fear across the U.S. coastal South, owing to their size, large mouths, and prehistoric appearance. Female alligators tap out at around 10 feet, though male alligators can grow larger. And while they prefer to eat fish, amphibians, and small mammals, alligators will snap their jaws at anything that comes too close. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission warns that even in neighborhoods where residents have learned to coexist with alligators, the potential for conflict always exists. Crawl, a 2019 horror movie, depicts a Florida father and daughter fighting a pack of vicious alligators that invade their home through hurricane floodwaters. But experts say that if treated with caution and left alone, alligators tend to keep to themselves. In fact, humans pose some threat to the species, which is protected. Drivers sometimes strike them trying to navigate roads in the rain. They can also get worrying as Debbie makes its way across the southeast. Other animals are also showing up in unusual places. Several videos after Debbie's landfall show a species known as walking catfish popping up in driveway puddles in Florida and South Carolina. The videos have drawn attention to the slippery mucus-covered species, which is native to Southeast Asia and considered unwanted but invasive, reports CBS, the BBC's American news partner. Experts say the biggest animal-related risk to humans in floodwaters is snakes, which are harder to spot. Subscribe to our C channel for more updates. Delta Airlines has expressed frustration with CrowdStrike in a new letter on Thursday, as the two companies continue to trade jabs after last month's massive global network outage. The US-based carrier accused the cybersecurity company of negligence, saying it was forced to cancel thousands of flights because of the outage and had lost at least 500 miners, 392, as a result. CrowdStrike had denied it was solely responsible for Delta's flight disruptions, which it said continued after other carriers came back online. Delta has since been hit by a class action lawsuit filed on behalf of affected passengers. The global glitch originated from CrowdStrike on 19th of July, after it had sent out a corrupted software update to its huge number of customers. Microsoft estimated that 8.5 million Windows devices around the world were disabled as a result. Delta Airlines services were impacted for days after the outage, even after other airlines appeared to have recovered. Delta cancelled around 7,000 flights over 5 days until 24 July and is now being investigated by the U.S. Department of Transportation over the disruptions. The airline has since blamed CrowdStrike and Microsoft for the disruptions and has threatened legal action against the two companies. Both CrowdStrike and Microsoft have rejected the claim that they are responsible for the disruptions at Delta. Delta's CEO Ed Bastian wrote in a filing with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission on Thursday that what happened was unacceptable. "Our customers and employees deserve better," Mr. Bastian wrote, adding that the technology meltdown affected 1.3 million of Delta's customers. CrowdStrike said on Sunday that it would defend itself aggressively should Delta take legal action against it. Microsoft also said it would fight back and added that its preliminary review shows Delta, unlike its competitors, was operating with an outdated IT infrastructure. In response, David Boies, an attorney representing Delta, wrote in a letter to CrowdStrike on Thursday that there is no basis to suggest that Delta was in any way responsible for the faulty software that crashed systems around the world. He added that Delta Airlines had invested billions of dollars in its technology and said it struggled to restore operations because of its reliance on Microsoft and CrowdStrike. In response, a CrowdStrike spokesperson accused Delta of pushing a midging. CrowdStrike has since been sued by its shareholders, who accused the company of making. CrowdStrike has denied the allegations. Subscribe for more updates. On Thursday, Donald Trump walked into a room of journalists gathered at his Mar-a-Lago estate for a news conference. He didn't look particularly happy. His remarks came after a week in which Kamala Harris and her new running mate, Tim Walz, have dominated media attention, raked in millions of dollars, and enjoyed a bump in polling. Trump's media event seemed more an attempt to win back the spotlight than announce anything new. Just before Trump stepped up to the podium, one of his advisors texted me the wry assessment that Donald Trump is never boring. The exclamation marks were his. The event included a couple of news items. Mr. Trump announced that he'd agreed to join a TV debate with Vice President Harris on 10 September. ABC News, the debate host, confirmed that Ms. Harris had agreed to participate as well. Trump also said he'd like to do 2 more debates. There's no word from the Harris team yet on whether they've accepted those additional matchups. Over the course of the hour-long event, Trump took dozens of questions, and he chastised Ms. Harris for failing to take questions from reporters since ascending to the top of the ticket. Much of the event, though, was spent on Trump's old favourites, as if he was reaching for his rally hits. He talked about poll numbers, the unfair media, the dire state of the country, and, yes, crowd sizes, even comparing his crowds to those of the civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Historically, one way Trump gets attention is by saying things that are controversial, and there was some of that today too. He suggested America is on the brink of a world war and said Jewish Americans who support Vice President Harris need to have your head examined. This attention deficit is an unusual position for Trump. The former president is not used to having to fight for the limelight, particularly in this election cycle. The Biden campaign was happy to let Trump dominate the news, in the belief that the more the race was about the former president, the better it would be for the current one. The Biden team wanted Trump front and center. But the shake-up on the Democratic side has been dramatic and newsworthy, and has pushed Trump off the front pages. To make things harder for the Republican candidate, much of the coverage of Ms. Harris's unexpected rollout as Democratic candidate has been positive. So the strategy by Democrats has flipped. Right now, Democrats are enjoying the media attention. Ms. Harris wants this race to be about her. And with all the Democratic political drama, the press has been happy to oblige. Hence the Mar-a-Lago news conference that didn't really have much news. Trump may do better following the advice of Mark Lotter, the Republican strategist who ran communication strategy for his 2020 campaign, who texted me to say, "The way the former president should win back attention was to stay focused." Define Harris and Walz on policy. He wins on policy and results. To be fair, there was some of that in this press event. Trump repeatedly described Ms. Harris as extreme and liberal. He did tout his own record on the economy and the border, but the attacks got rather lost in his grievance about crowd sizes and how they are reported, even suggesting that there may be something unconstitutional about the Harris campaign. And then it was over. And as if to prove a point, within minutes of Trump walking off stage, the fickle cable news cameras had shifted their lenses from Florida to Michigan, where Miss Harris and Mr. Walz were holding a meeting with union workers. It was the Democrats' time for some press coverage. Once again, subscribe for more updates. ABC News has said it will host the first debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris on 10 September. The network confirmed the showdown in a post on X, formerly Twitter, after Trump said on Thursday that he would be open to debating his Democratic rival multiple times before the November election. "We think we should do 3 debates," Trump said, suggesting 2 additional debates that he said would be hosted by Fox News and NBC, respectively. Ms. Harris confirmed that she will attend the ABC debate while at an event in Michigan on Thursday, and said later that she would be open to additional debates. The network said the debate will be moderated by World News Tonight anchor and managing editor David Muir and ABC News Live Prime anchor Lindsay Davis. "I am looking forward to debating Donald Trump, and we have a date of September 10th. I hear he's finally committed to it, and I'm looking forward to it," Ms. Harris said at the event in Detroit. Trump, the Republican candidate, debated President Joe Biden once in June. The two were slated to do so again on 10 September, but Mr. Biden withdrew from the presidential race after a disastrous performance against Trump in the televised matchup. That paved the way for Ms. Harris to become the Democratic nominee. The confirmation of the debate on ABC marks an end to a back and forth that followed Mr. Biden's decision to leave the race between the Trump and Harris campaigns over that planned showdown. Trump had previously said that he wanted a debate hosted by the conservative network Fox News, saying it would take place in Pennsylvania, at a site in an area to be determined. The Harris campaign had maintained they would still like to debate Trump on 10 September. At a news conference on Thursday at his Mar-a-Lago resort, Trump also said he would like to debate Ms. Harris 2 additional times, on 4 September on Fox News and on 25 September on NBC. Trump said that CBS will host a debate between the 2 vice presidential nominees, Republican J.D. Vance and Democratic Tim Walz. NBC News is reportedly in discussions with both campaigns about a potential debate this autumn, the New York Times reported. Fox News said it sent formal letters to both campaigns last month, proposing a September debate in Pennsylvania, though the Harris campaign said on Thursday that Trump has to show up to the ABC debate before they confirm any further showdowns. Trump also criticized Ms. Harris for not taking reporter questions or doing an interview since she became the likely Democratic nominee just over 2 weeks ago. He called her barely competent and criticized her intelligence. Later on Thursday, Ms. Harris told reporters that she has asked her team to get an interview scheduled before the end of the month. Trump's hour-long event was held amid reports that his campaign is feeling the pressure from Democrats, who have new enthusiasm under Ms. Harris and have been dominating headlines. National and battleground state polls suggest her campaign has gained ground in recent days, though the race for the White House remains a close contest. The former president denied he had recalibrated his campaign to challenge Ms. Harris instead of Mr. Biden, and he appeared to prickle when asked about the audience Ms. Harris draws at rallies. "Oh, give me a break," he said, arguing that crowds at his rallies were larger than at hers. His Thursday news conference is the first he has held in several months, as his campaign has previously focused on holding rallies across the country. Trump also praised his running mate Mr. Vance, who was recently under fire for comments he made in 2021, when he said those without children shouldn't be leading the country, and that women who don't have children are miserable and childless cat ladies. "I have to tell you, J.D. Vance has really stepped up," Trump said. "He's doing a fantastic job." He took aim at Ms. Harris's track record on immigration and the economy, and he repeated his belief that US presidents should have a say over interest rates and monetary policy, a departure from the long-standing practice of having the US Federal Reserve, an independent body, oversee these matters. He emphasized his priorities of lowering inflation, lowering crime rates, and strengthening the military. Ms. Harris on Thursday addressed United Auto Workers in Detroit and thanked the union for endorsing her. She said there are 89 days to get this done. Ahead of the election, subscribe for more.
The US presidential election takes place on the 5th of November, but it's possible the candidate with the most votes won't be the winner. This is because the president is not chosen directly by the voters, but by what's known as the Electoral College. Here's how it works. So who are Americans voting for? When Americans take part in November's presidential election, most of them will cast a vote for either Democrat Kamala Harris or Republican Donald Trump. But that vote actually goes towards shaping the makeup of a group of officials who will represent Ms. Harris or Mr. Trump in the Electoral College. The word college here simply refers to a group of people with a shared task. These people are electors, and their job is to choose the president and vice president. The Electoral College meets every 4 years, a few weeks after Election Day, to carry out that task. How does the Electoral College work? The number of electors from each state is roughly in line with the size of its population. Each state gets as many electors as it has lawmakers in the U.S. Congress, the House and Senate. California has the most electors, 54, while a handful of sparsely populated states like Wyoming, Alaska, and North Dakota, and Washington, D.C., have the minimum of 3. There are 538 electors in total. Each elector represents one electoral vote, and a candidate needs to gain a majority of the votes, 270 or more, to win the presidency. Generally, states award all their Electoral College votes to whoever won the poll of ordinary voters in the state. For example, if a candidate wins 50.1% of the vote in Texas, they are awarded all of the state's 40 electoral votes. Alternatively, a candidate could win still pick up the same number of electoral votes. It's therefore possible for a candidate to become president by winning a number of tight races in certain states, despite having fewer votes across the country. What are the pros and cons of the Electoral College? Advantages. Smaller states remain important to candidates. Candidates don't need to travel the whole country. Recounts are easier because officials can isolate the issue in one state. Disadvantages. Lots of voters feel their vote does not matter. Too much power resides in swing states, see below. The popular vote winner can lose the election. More on that later. Risk of fake electors. More follows on that too. What are swing states? Most states consistently vote for the same party each election. This is why presidential candidates target specific swing states, where the vote could go either way rather than trying to win over voters across the country. In 2024, the top battleground states are Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Has a candidate lost the public vote but become president? Yes. In fact, 2 out of the last 6 elections were won by candidates who had fewer votes from the general public. In 2016, Donald Trump was almost 3 million votes behind Hillary Clinton. In 2000, George W. Bush defeated Democratic candidate Al Gore, who won the popular vote by more than 500,000. Only 3 other presidents have been elected without winning the popular vote, all of them in the 19th century. Why was the system chosen? When the U.S. Constitution was being drawn up in 1787, a national popular vote to elect a president was practically impossible, country size and tricky communications. So the framers of the Constitution created the Electoral College, with each state choosing electors. Smaller states favored the system as it gave them more of a voice than a nationwide popular vote to decide the president. The Electoral College was also favored by southern states, where slaves made up a large portion of the population. Even though slaves didn't vote, they were counted in the U.S. Census as 3/5 of a person. Since the number of electoral votes was determined by the size of a state's population, southern states had more influence in electing a president than a direct public vote would have given them. Do electors have to vote for the candidate who won? In some states, electors could vote for whichever candidate they prefer, regardless of who voters backed. But in practice, electors almost always vote for the candidate who wins the most votes in their state. If an elector votes against their state's presidential pick, they are termed faithless. In 2016, 7 electoral college votes were cast this way, but no result has been changed by faithless electors. In some states, faithless electors can be liable for fines or prosecuted for their votes or abstaining. What is a fake elector? In 2020, U.S. voters became familiar with the concept of fake electors after pro-Trump Republicans in 7 U.S. states created their own electors in a bid to overturn the election's results. In some cases, they created and signed official-looking documents or arrived at state capitals on the 14th of December, when electors across the country met to officially cast their votes. Some of those involved have faced prosecution, and investigations are still ongoing. The electoral votes allocated to each state, 270 out of 538, are needed to win the presidency. 3 North Dakota, 28 New York, 54 California, 40 Texas, 30 Florida. What happens if the candidates tie in electoral votes? If there is no majority winner, the House of Representatives, the lower house of U.S. lawmakers, will then vote to elect the president. This has happened only once, when in 1824 4 candidates split the electoral vote, denying any one of them a majority. With 2 parties dominating the U.S. system, this is unlikely to happen today. What do you know and what you think? Share your feedback in comments. Subscribe to our channel for more updates. Thanks for watching.
When 2 American astronauts blasted off on a test mission to the International Space Station on the 5th of June, they were expecting to be back home in a matter of days. But things didn't quite go to plan. In fact, Barry Butch Wilmore and Sunita Williams are still there, floating high above the Earth nearly 2 months later. The pair, who are stuck indefinitely, now face the sudden prospect of missing the summer entirely, and even spending Christmas and New Year in space. Mr. Wilmore, 61, and Miss Williams, 58, flew a Boeing Starliner spacecraft to the station. It was the first flight of its kind with people on board, and was a test designed to see how the new spacecraft performs before it is used more regularly. Problems, however, emerged as it made its approach. These included leaks in its propulsion system and some of its thrusters shutting down. So while they made it to the space station safely, they will need an alternative mode of transport to get home if the Starliner is not deemed safe to return to Earth. At a news briefing on Wednesday, NASA officials said no firm decisions had been made when it comes to next steps. Our prime option is to return Butch and Suni on Starliner, Steve Stick, manager of NASA's Commercial Crew program, said. However, we have done the requisite planning to make sure we have other options open. One potential option being considered, they said, is to attach the 2 astronauts to a mission that is scheduled to launch in September and return them to Earth with that mission in February 2025. That flight to the space station will be made by a SpaceX Crew Dragon craft. The initial plan was for 4 crew members to be aboard, but 2 of the seats could be left empty if needed. That plan would mean the astronauts would spend more than 8 months, rather than 8 days, aboard the International Space Station, ISS. If the Crew Dragon is used, the Starliner craft would be returned to Earth without any crew, under computer control. NASA officials said it could take a week or more for a final decision to be made. Ken Bowersox, NASA's Director of Space Operations, told reporters the chances of an uncrewed return of the Starliner have increased a little bit based on where things have gone over the last week or two. That's why we're looking more closely at that option to make sure that we can handle it, he said. Using a SpaceX craft to return the astronauts would be a blow to Boeing, which has for years tried to compete with the company and its more experienced Crew Dragon. Earlier this week, NASA used a SpaceX rocket to deliver more food and supplies to the ISS, including extra clothes for the 2 astronauts. Last month, in a short press briefing, the pair said they were absolutely confident in the return trip and Starliner was truly impressive. This is the 3rd stint aboard the ISS for Miss Williams, a retired Navy helicopter pilot, while Mr. Wilmore is a former fighter jet pilot who has been to space twice before. "We've been thoroughly busy up here, integrated right into the crew," Miss Williams told reporters during a recent briefing call. "It feels like coming back home. It feels good to float around. It feels good to be in space and work up here with the International Space Station team," she said. "So yeah, it's great to be up here." Boeing was hoping that the maiden Starliner mission would pave the way for regular use of its capsule for missions back and forth to the station. The SpaceX Crew Dragon has been approved for NASA missions since 2020. Although the astronauts will spend much more time in space than they initially planned, others have spent much longer periods above the Earth's surface. Russian Valery Polyakov spent 437 days in space, in aboard the Mir space station in the mid-1990s. Last year, Frank Rubio returned from the ISS after 371 days, the longest time an American has spent in space. And Russia's Oleg Kononenko, also currently aboard ISS, is the first person to have spent more than 1,000 days in space during the course of their career. In their briefings and interviews, the 2 Americans have been upbeat about their situation. "I'm not complaining that we're here for a couple extra weeks," Ms. Williams said last month. As things stand, the pair may be there for many more weeks to come. Share your feedback in comment section. Subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.
It's been a busy couple of weeks in American politics since Kamala Harris replaced Joe Biden on the Democratic ticket. On Tuesday, she made her selection for vice president. Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota and a former congressman, teacher and Army veteran. Josh Shapiro and Andy Beshear, the governors of Pennsylvania and Kentucky, had been in the running, as had Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. The BBC spoke to Democratic voters on what they thought of the choice. Latim Simon Peter, age 33, from Minnesota. Mr. Peter was considering supporting a third-party candidate in November when Biden was still atop the ticket, but now he's fully backing Harris-Walz. First of all, it's great for Minnesota to have someone on the ticket, and yesterday, everybody was going crazy over here. And he's great for the country because he does not bring too much baggage. Maybe that is safer. I struggled quite a bit when Biden was on the ticket, and I was even leaning towards voting for a third party. So having Harris on the ticket gives me the option to vote for the ticket that I want to vote for. On a typical day, in a normal situation, this should be a very straightforward, easy choice for the American people given the history of the former president. But Trump's people vote and they show up, so this should not be taken for granted. I hope Harris and Walz keep the momentum. Catherine Vaughn, age 43, from Tennessee, Democratic Party. Miss Vaughn, who grew up in a Republican household but votes Democrat, wants to see Mr. Walz in a debate with Trump's running mate J.D. Vance. He's a teacher of 20 years. He's a rural Democrat. I'm a teacher. I'm a rural Democrat. He's an IVF parent. I'm also an infertility parent. He's a great pick. I think this is going to add a lot of energy to the campaign. He offers so much. The Harris-Walz ticket is going to be incredibly competitive with the Trump-Vance ticket. I would love to see the 2 VP candidates debate. You have someone who is actually from rural America, who still works as a farmer. versus someone who left his rural roots as quickly as he could and then proceeded to profit off of them after his Ivy League education. Rural communities had it really rough under Trump. We lost our child tax credits. IVF has been under attack since Roe, the federal right to abortion, was dismantled. This gives hope that maybe we will have a strong advocate for those aspects of life that are so close to mothers and children and teachers. Tyrone Mansfield, age 57. From Texas, Democratic Party. Mr. Mansfield believes the Harris-Walz ticket would fight to protect women's rights and the LGBTQ community. What I have learned about the VP pick is that he has fought for the rights of women to have agency over their own bodies. If we had policies limiting men's abilities to make decisions about their bodies, there would be riots and revolts. He passed sensible gun policies, legalized recreational marijuana, passed paid family leave, and restored voting rights and invested $1 billion in affordable housing. I'm so much more hopeful than I was a few weeks ago when our candidate was a president who clearly no longer had the mental capacity to compete with the viciousness of Trump and his supporters. I believe that Harris-Walz will work hard to find a pathway to more humane laws, to protect working-class people, and to honor the rights of women to make their own choices about their bodies, and to stand up for the LGBTQ+ community. I'm stoked and look forward to victory in November. Annie Tai, age 43. From Illinois, Democratic Party. Ms. Tai initially preferred Mark Kelly as the VP choice, but her research on Mr. Walz has turned her head. I'm excited. Walz brings something to the party that Shapiro doesn't, and somehow Kelly doesn't seem to either. He's a fun, engaging guy who gives fun interviews, and he has a background that I think a lot of Americans can appreciate. I think she, Ms. Harris, did a really smart thing. Somebody who's a gun guy could bring in some of the people who are really hesitant to vote for an anti-gun liberal, but Walz has a hunting background and at one point had a positive rating with the NRA. I really appreciate that he's worked really hard with kids. I love that he facilitated a gay-straight alliance when he was a teacher, and he's really worked to make sure that people have a minimum wage that is adequate. Kamala and Walz will blow the Republicans out of the water. Isaac Chandler, age 30, from Oklahoma, Democratic Party. Mr. Chandler thinks Mr. Walz is the perfect choice to shore up Democratic support. Looking at all Walz's policies, he's a very progressive pick. I really like that he stood up for unions. I really appreciate that he fought so hard for kids to be able to have free lunches in schools in his state. He has been very adamant about needing peace in Gaza. I'm really happy with the pick because he feels more inspiring. He reminds me of a really nice grandpa, even though he's basically the same age as Kamala Harris. I like that someone who has been a big proponent of helping people who are struggling is the pick. It's what we need right now in this country. The Harris-Walz ticket is more representative of the wider American public than the Trump-Vance ticket. It makes me feel a lot more inspired for this election. Mary Mendenhall, age 34. From New York, Democratic Party. Ms. Mendenhall said she would have reluctantly voted for Mr. Biden and Ms. Harris. Now she's excited by the Harris-Walz ticket. I was pleasantly surprised. It seemed like it was going to go to Josh Shapiro, but I think Tim Walz was the better choice. I don't know that much about him, but I know he's been a really good governor in Minnesota and seems to support progressive values. I'm cautiously optimistic. I know it's going to be difficult, but Walz compared to Vance, there's really no comparison. I would love to see the two of them debate. I don't know if that will happen, but I do feel pretty good about it. It's amazing how within a matter of a few weeks, the outlook for the election really turned around. With Biden and Harris, there was essentially no hope of winning, but now there is at least a fighting chance to win. Share your feedbacks in comment section. Subscribe for more updates. Thanks for watching.
US President Joe Biden has said he is not confident there will be a peaceful transition of power if Donald Trump loses the presidential election in November. In his first interview since he dramatically dropped out of the race last month, Mr. Biden told CBS News, "If Trump loses, I'm not confident at all. Trump means what he says. We don't take him seriously. He means it. All this stuff about if we lose, it will be a bloodbath." Mr. Trump's comment that it would be a bloodbath for the country if he loses the election, made as he was talking about the auto industry in March, triggered a wave of criticism. Democrats were quick to reiterate their campaign message that the former president poses a threat to democracy. The Biden campaign used the bloodbath comment in an ad posted on its social media accounts, and a spokesman accused Mr. Trump of encouraging and excusing political violence. The Trump campaign, however, said the comment was specifically about the auto industry and had been deliberately taken out of context. It sent a fundraising email which said Trump's political opponents and others had been viciously misquoting him. They fully understood that I was simply referring to imports allowed by crooked Joe Biden, which are killing the automobile industry, Trump wrote on social media at the time. Mr. Biden has previously expressed concern that his former rival would not accept the result of the election. During the presidential debate on CNN in June, which triggered the crisis over Mr. Biden's candidacy that ultimately saw stand aside and endorse Kamala Harris, Trump was asked directly whether he would accept the 2024 election results. "If it's a fair and legal and good election, absolutely," he responded, after initially avoiding the question. Trump made repeated unfounded claims of election fraud in 2020 after he lost that election to Mr. Biden. His supporters stormed the Capitol building in January 2021 in an effort to stop the election result from being certified. Many in attendance that day repeated the former president's claims that the vote had been rigged. In the CBS interview clip released on Wednesday, which was posted on X, Mr. Biden also appeared to suggest there were efforts to complicate the post-election certification processes, although it was unclear exactly what he was referring to. "Look what they're trying to do now in the local election districts where people count the votes," he said. "You can't love your country only when you win."
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are the two major party candidates in the 2024 presidential election, but dozens of other people are also running. None is on a realistic path to the White House, but the most well-known threaten to siphon away support from the Democratic and Republican candidates. Here are the people with the greatest potential to disrupt the race. Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., a former environmental lawyer known for his anti-vaccine activism, the nephew of former President John Kennedy, initially sought, and failed, to run as a Democrat. The 70-year-old then mounted an independent challenge to what he called the two-headed monster of American politics. At least 15 of his relatives endorsed Joe Biden before he dropped out of the race. "The Democrats are frightened that I'm going to spoil the election for President Biden. The Republicans are frightened that I'm going to spoil it for President Trump," he said at the time. The truth is, they're both right. During his campaign, Mr. Kennedy has been criticized for repeating debunked conspiracy theories, such as a connection between childhood vaccines and autism, and for once likening COVID vaccine mandates to Nazi Germany. His latest controversy is perhaps the most wacky story of any campaign, his video admission to comedian Roseanne Barr that he once dumped a bear carcass in Central Park. His populist economic message and criticism of the two major parties initially gave him a boost in the polls on the back of the many disaffected voters unhappy with the choice of Biden or Trump. He narrowly missed qualifying for the first presidential debate in late June, but with Ms. Harris in the race, he has seen his popularity drop to single digits. Jill Stein, the activist and doctor, ran as the Green Party's candidate in 2012 and 2016. Now back at 74 years old, she recently told BBC Americas that Americans are not voting for a candidate they like. They're generally voting against the candidate they hate the most. And that's no way for a democracy to function. Ms. Stein calls for an economic bill of rights that would include universal access to healthcare and a right to employment. She also vows to fight climate change, defend abortion access and transgender rights, and was recently arrested at a student protest on behalf of Gaza. She is unlikely to get more than 2% of the vote, but that could still play spoiler to Ms. Harris. Hillary Clinton supporters partly blame her for the Democrats' narrow defeat in 2016. In 3 critical states, Mrs. Clinton lost to Mr. Trump by fewer votes than Ms. Stein received. According to the party's website, Ms. Stein will be on the ballot in at least 20 states. She has yet to announce a running mate. Cornel West. The 70-year-old activist and well-known academic has a complicated presidential bid. He launched it in June with the People's Party. After falling out with the group, Mr. West said he would seek the Green Party's nomination, but then changed course to run as an independent. His socialist platform includes funding public healthcare and slashing the U.S. defense budget. Melina Abdullah, a member of the board of directors of the Black Lives Matter grassroots organization, is his running mate. He has attacked Mr. Biden as a war criminal and Mr. Trump as a fascist Pied Piper. His candidacy could be a threat to Ms. Harris in crucial swing states like Michigan, although he is currently on the ballot in only 6 states and has struggled to raise money. Chase Oliver. The Libertarian Party, the third biggest political party in the country, has nominated Chase Oliver as their presidential candidate, with Mike Termat as his running mate. In doing so, they spurned Mr. Trump and Mr. Kennedy, both of whom spoke at the party's convention this month in a bid for its support. Mr. Trump received a notably unfriendly reception and lashed out at the audience during his speech. Mr. Oliver, an openly gay sales executive who previously ran on the Libertarian ticket for U.S. congressional races in Georgia, says voters are done with picking from the lesser of two evils. I'm just about to be the age of 40. I'm living the life of a normal American. I understand what it's like to go to the grocery store with the same amount of money, but seeing less and less filling up the cart. Those are things that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are so far removed from that they just can't communicate those values anymore. His campaign advocates for balancing the budget, ending military support to Israel and Ukraine, closing all overseas U.S. military bases and abolishing the death penalty. Libertarians support small government and individual freedoms, typically pulling 1 to 3% of the vote from Republicans. The party's nominee in 2020 received more votes than Mr. Trump's margin of defeat in 3 battleground states. Share your thoughts and comments. Subscribe to latest updates. Within hours of Tim Walz being declared winner of the Democratic Veep Stakes, Republican accusations that he is pro-China came thick and fast. Communist China is very happy, Donald Trump's former ambassador to Germany, Richard Grenell, said on Twitter X. No one is more pro-China than Marxist Walz. Tom Cotton, a Republican senator, said Mr. Walz owed an explanation about his unusual 35-year relationship with Communist China. MAGA War Room, an influential X account supporting Donald Trump, unearthed a 2016 video in which Mr. Walz told the farming policy outlet AgriPulse that the US and China did not need to have an adversarial relationship. But what does the record show? Republicans may want to weaponize Mr. Walz's links to China, but it's pretty slim pickings. Walz's record. Mr. Walz's personal relationship with China does indeed extend back decades. It began in 1989 when, fresh out of college, Mr. Walz began a Harvard University volunteer program teaching American history and English at the Foshan, No-One High School in southern China. He later set up a business with his wife Gwen, organizing annual summer educational trips to China. The venture lasted more than a decade, and by his own estimation, Mr. Walz returned to the country around 30 times. But if anything, Mr. Walz has been pretty hawkish towards its government, particularly on human rights. As a congressman, he met the Dalai Lama and, before his jailing, the high-profile Hong Kong democracy activist Joshua Wong. Both men would place at the top of the Chinese government's list of public enemies. In terms of his congressional record, there is not much for China to like. He spent over a decade on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, a body focused on scrutinizing the Chinese government's human rights abuses. In 2016, the same year he met the Dalai Lama, he also invited the then leader of Tibet's government in exile, Lobsang Sangay, into his congressional office to meet a group of Minnesota high schoolers. Hong Kong. Mr. Walz lent his strong backing to the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which imposed sanctions on Chinese and Hong Kong officials for human rights abuses during the city's democracy protests. Jeffrey Ingo, a democracy activist now based in the US, has praised Mr. Walz's commitment to getting the legislation passed in 2019. We knocked on every door when the #HKHRDA lacked momentum, he wrote on X after Mr. Walz was confirmed as the Harris VP choice. Only Walz answered his. Mr. No praised Mr. Walz as the sole House Democrat willing to keep co-sponsoring the bill. Republican Chris Smith was the bill's other sponsor. The Chinese reaction: Mr. Walz's elevation to the Democratic ticket has prompted interest on Chinese social media. He once described his decision to teach in China as one of the best things I've ever done, and there were signs of hope in some of the comments that, if he wins, it may signal better US-China ties. One Weibo user pointed out that Walz's unique background gives him a real perspective on China, and he could promote cultural exchanges when relations are extremely difficult. But others wondered whether that may be assuming too much. The fact that his teaching posting took place in 1989, the year of the Tiananmen Square massacre in Beijing, was not lost on some. The Chinese cannot say much about the massacre for risk of getting censored. They refer to it obliquely. One comment simply said, "If you know, you know." Foreigners who were in China at that time are the most anti-China, said another user. Indeed, Mr. Walz has often spoken publicly about his horror at the crushing of the. No surprise that evidence can be found of Mr. Walz expressing views that align with that consensus. On the flip side, Donald Trump's own brand suits and ties were made in China, and he and his daughter Ivanka registered dozens of trademarks there. Far from being pro-China, Mr. Walz's record marks him out as someone who has taken a more nuanced view. He has spoken of the need for dialogue and cooperation on issues such as trade and climate change, but remains fiercely critical when it comes to human rights. That stance was in evidence from the very start of the relationship. When returning to Nebraska after his year in China, he told a local newspaper that there were no limits to what the Chinese could accomplish. If they had proper leadership, he added. Subscribe for more updates. Republicans have sharpened their attacks on Minnesota Governor Tim Walz over his response to the mass protests that erupted in his state after the 2020 police killing of George Floyd. As the governor kicks off his campaign as Kamala Harris's running mate, his critics have accused him of bungling the response to the violence by being slow to deploy the National Guard. At least 2 people were killed and over 600 arrested during the protests, which caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damages across Minnesota. The governor recently defended his actions, saying that his administration tried to do the best it could in a difficult situation. Floyd's death at the hands of Derek Chauvin, a white Minneapolis police officer, sparked days of protests, some of which descended into riots and looting. The unrest quickly overwhelmed local authorities, prompting Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey to request Mr. Walz to deploy the National Guard 2 days after Floyd's death on the 25th of May in 2020. A separate written request for 600 troops came just hours later from the city's police chief, but it was not until the 28th of May, 3 days into the violence, that Mr. Walz signed an executive order activating Minnesota's National Guard, citing extensive damage to private property and a dangerous situation for protesters and first responders. While some troops were deployed that night, they were mostly tasked with protecting federal buildings and were unable to prevent riots, which saw a local police station set ablaze. "We were abandoned," an unnamed local official told an external review of the state's response prepared for Minnesota's Department of Public Safety in 2022. By the time the National Guard even came, mostly everything had quieted down. A separate report put together by the then Republican-controlled Minnesota Senate in October 2020 said that Mr. Walz had the ability and duty to use force and law enforcement to stop violence, but he did not. Criticism of the governor's handling of the protests in the summer of 2020 has re-emerged as an attack line from Republicans following the announcement that Mr. Walz would be joining the Harris campaign. At a rally just hours after the news, Republican vice presidential hopeful J.D. Vance questioned whether black business owners in Minneapolis are grateful that Mr. Walz allowed rioters to burn down their business. The BBC has contacted the governor's office for comment. Mr. Walz has said the city's mayor did not give him adequate information to provide the soldiers a mission at that time. "Decisions were made in a situation that is what it is," Mr. Walz said at a news conference earlier this month, "and I simply believe that we tried to do the best we can in each of those." How did Tim Walz respond to Floyd's death? The reality of the situation on the ground in May 2020, experts note, was both complex and confusing. When everything was unfolding that summer, Minneapolis city leaders were not familiar with the process for asking for the National Guard's help, Duchess Harris, a professor of American Studies at Minnesota's Macalester College who focuses on African American political history and human rights, told the BBC. It was unprecedented, added Ms. Harris, who was appointed by Mr. Walz to be on Minnesota's Board of Public Defense. Several after-action assessments of the response to the riots also highlight communications breakdowns between city and state officials. One review, published by the City of Minneapolis in 2020, found that city officials failed to go through proper channels when they requested help. Instead, they contacted Mr. Walz directly to ask him to deploy troops. Governor Walz is a 24-year veteran of Minnesota's National Guard, Ms. Harris added. He pushed the mayor of Minneapolis for details. That was his job. The subsequent activation of Minnesota's National Guard was the largest since the Second World War. At the time of their deployment, then-President Trump reportedly approved of Mr. Walz's handling of the protests, according to a recording of a phone call obtained by ABC News. In the call, the former president tells a group of governors that Mr. Walz dominated and praises his leadership as an example for other states to follow. I know Governor Walz is on the phone, and we spoke, and I fully agree with the way he handled it the last couple of days, Trump said in the 1st of June 2020 call. I was very happy with the last couple of days, Tim, Trump continued. You called up big numbers, and the big numbers knocked them out so fast it was like bowling pins. Michelle Phelps, a sociology professor at the University of Minnesota and the author of a book that examined the protest, told the BBC that a more forceful response could have inadvertently backfired as authorities sought to control the protests. There's a vision in which if we had had a more conservative governor that escalated the state response in the way that President Trump wanted, we would have seen more violence and more destruction, she said. Some advocates, including civil rights leader Al Sharpton, have also praised Mr. Walz's handling of the aftermath and credited him for addressing issues of social justice and police brutality. Mr. Walz was re-elected as Minnesota's governor in 2022, 2 years after the protests. While both Ms. Harris and Ms. Phelps said they expect Republicans to continue to attack Mr. Walz for his handling of the protests, neither expect the issue will create a political liability for the governor among undecided voters. It's not surprising that Republicans are using this line of attack. It highlights that there are just not that many weaknesses of Walz to attack, Ms. Phelps said. And I don't think it's going to be particularly effective or decisive, she added. Subscribe for more updates.
A man was found guilty by a Los Angeles jury on Wednesday of sending his 17-year-old son to kill rapper PNB Rock. Freddie Trone, 42, was found guilty of multiple charges, including murder, 2 counts of second-degree robbery, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit robbery after the Philadelphia hip-hop star was shot dead in September 2022. The rapper was eating at a Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles restaurant in Los Angeles with his girlfriend, who is the mother of his 4-year-old child, when the teen, wearing a ski mask, walked into the restaurant, demanded the artist's jewelry, and opened fire. Police said the teen removed items from the victim, then fled in a waiting getaway car, which Trone was accused of driving, according to local media. PNB suffered multiple gunshot wounds and was pronounced dead at a local hospital less than an hour later. Prosecutors during the trial argued the teen was acting on his father's orders, while Trone's defense team said he was only an accessory after the crimes. The teen, who is now 19 years old, was also arrested on murder and robbery charges in the case. But, according to local media, he has not been found competent to stand trial yet. A third man, Tremont Jones, was charged in the case and found guilty on 2 counts of second-degree robbery and 1 count of conspiracy to commit a robbery. Both Jones and Trone are scheduled to be sentenced on 27 August. During Trone's trial, Deputy District Attorney Timothy Richardson told jurors Trone drove his son in a coordinated act to steal expensive jewelry, arguing the motive was about $500,000 worth of jewelry, according to Fox 11 in Los Angeles. Prosecutors outlined that Jones had seen the rapper at the restaurant and passed along information to Trone as to what jewelry the artist was wearing, the outlet reported. Trone's defense team argued he wasn't there and never told his son or anyone to do anything. His attorney claimed prosecutors had zeroed in on the wrong person and said race played a part in his conviction, Fox 11 reported. Justice has been served for Mr. Allen and his family who have endured unimaginable pain, losing a loved one to such senseless violence, District Attorney Gascon said Wednesday after the convictions. Let this serve as a clear message to anyone who threatens the safety and well-being of our community. Our office will relentlessly pursue charges and work tirelessly to bring offenders to justice. The rapper's girlfriend, Stephanie Sibunhang, said PMB saved her life in the incident, writing on Instagram after the attack, "I'm not supposed to be here, but because of him, I am." She described the traumatic aftermath of the shooting, not being able to ride with him in an ambulance and being forced out of the restaurant as police investigated. "I feel so empty," she wrote after the attack. "My world is dark now. My heart is broken for the kids." PMB, whose real name is Rakeem Hashim Allen, rose to fame with the release of his 2016 hit Selfish and had collaborated with artists including Ed Sheeran. Tributes flooded in for PMB after his death, from artists including Drake, who posted a photo of the two together on his Instagram story. Rapper Offset posted a Twitter tribute urging followers to pray for PMB's 2 children, with Nicki Minaj calling him a pleasure to work with. PMB Rock was born in Philadelphia in 1991, going on to record 2 studio albums, Catch These Vibes and Trap Star Turned Pop Star. He released his final song, Love Me Again, just 2 days before the shooting. Subscribe for more updates. America was introduced to a fresh political family on Tuesday when Vice President Kamala Harris appointed Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as her running mate. While Gwen Walz, the 2-term governor's wife, may not officially be on the ticket, her background is getting plenty of attention too. An educator for more than 2 decades and lifelong Minnesotan, Miss Walz was an agenda setter during husband's time in office. She prioritized education and criminal justice reform, initiatives that could see traction in Washington with a Harris-Walz White House. Mrs. Walz, 58, met the Minnesota governor when the two were teaching in Nebraska. They married in 1994 and share 2 children, Hope and Gus. Mr. Walz has previously spoken about the couple's infertility struggles and how they used IVF to conceive. While Mr. Walz created a social media forward platform for himself during his time as governor, Miss Walz appears to have taken on a less public role. She only created an Instagram account in recent days. She also participated in few media interviews as Minnesota's First Lady. When she does speak publicly, however, it is often about her commitment to education, criminal justice reform, and how the two intersect. Education is transformational, and I believe that in every sense of the word, Ms. Walz said during a 2019 interview with PBS. And if we're going to solve problems, we have to look at real ways to solve problems, and education is a real predictor of not going back to prison. Her first public event as First Lady of Minnesota was a rally for restoring convicted felons' voting rights. Ms. Walz also chaired a task force on recidivism and toured state prisons. "It's a crucial conversation to have," Ms. Walz said in an interview with Minnesota Public Radio in 2019. "I'm convinced that people are looking for ways to address all kinds of different issues within corrections and within criminal justice." She is said to advise her husband, and she is the first Minnesota governor's spouse to have an office in the state capital. Since her launch into national politics this week, she's also been on the receiving end of criticism from the right, especially for comments she made during Minneapolis's 2020 racial justice protests following the death of George Floyd. In a now viral clip, Ms. Wiles described the smell of the burning tyres and said she kept the window open for as long as she could because I felt that was such a touchstone of what was happening. Republicans are using the clip to cast Ms. Wiles and her husband as too far left for voters. Subscribe to our channel for more updates.